welcome to episode, Michael, what episode is it? 33?
Oh, shit, you're doing this to me. It's going to be episode 34.
34. I can't believe it myself. Welcome
know.
to episode 34 of the Family Pictures podcast. And then we're here today with a really family-friendly movie
Yeah.
from 1995 called Kids, directed by Larry Clark, who I have a feeling will have a lot of feelings about in this podcast, and
yes.
written by Harmony Korine and starring a whole cast of kids, some who go on to have significant careers like Chloe Sevigny, who I love, Rosario Dawson, who I love, some who come to a bitter end, and we'll talk about that, I think, at length in this episode. But this is an interesting episode because it's almost like we're going to have to talk about two competing films, because we started saying, okay, we're going to dig in on the independent films from the 90s, which is kind of, that's the tear we're going on, folks. So if you're an independent film from the 90s kind of person, these next episodes are for you. So that's the tear we're going on. But Michael, in all his research genius, said, hey, Jim, I found this great documentary about kids called We Were Once Kids from 2021, which was made and kind of features a whole series of the kids in the background of this film. And it talks about some of the impact this film from 1995 has still had on kids who are no longer kids, as recent as 2021 when that documentary was made. So it's kind of going to be a bifurcated episode. Is that fair to say, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, just to fill that a teeny bit more, I wanted to shout out the director of the documentary is Eddie Martin, and it's primarily through the voice of Hamilton Harris, who's one of the Washington Square Park kids, who, you know, basically gives us a tutorial of how to roll a blunt from a cigar wrapper and with some marijuana leaves. And he is so effective in reclaiming. And that's why in the theme of like Jim's career, this is a bit of a reclaiming of the film Kids for the story of the kids themselves. So we have Larry Clark, who's this kind of famous, infamous documentary filmmaker, a photographer who has a book that's pretty famous, and I'm blanking on the name of it right now, where it involves his history with, drug abuse in connection to Vietnam veterans. And it's really well known. And this becomes an avenue in which he kind of ingratiates himself with these boys and girls, literally boys and girls, ages anywhere between, you get a sense of like 14 and 19, that hang out in Washington Square Park and skate. And their energy, and they're a family that Hamilton Harris talks about, that's born out of skating in their shared struggle in this impoverished lives. Many of them live without much parental influence. Some have more than others, but in particular, we're going to learn about Justin Pierce and Harold Hunter, who are two of the primary characters of the film.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is immediately apparent, and both the film Kids and the documentary We Were Once Kids do a good job about, is trying to contextualize New York in the early 90s and what that looked like. And, this is a hard scrabbled New York coming out of the kind of, I would say, the low point of maybe New York's career, maybe even beyond the 70s, is the 80s, when, they start with like burning out major apartment buildings and just kind of making space for what would be the shift towards the gentrification in the 90s and the 2000s. Like, New York definitely has a narrative arc where the 80s might be its low point, and then it starts to kind of rebuild itself in the 90s. Well, these kids seem to all be kind of from displaced families or broken families, and they're in some ways feeling the pressure of a changing New York, and they congregate in Washington Square Park. And to your point, Michael, they are really like a family, and not only just a family, but a family of skaters by and large, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so skateboarding becomes this alternative identity where Hamilton talks about how so many of these kids connected and kind of created and forged a bond and an identity that kind of I'm very interested, and you got to keep me on track here because I am going to go in all sorts of ways as I usually do. Like one of the things that immediately struck me, I'm a skater from the 80s. I'm from Long Island, right? So I kind of have some connection with this kind of scene. In fact, I kind of come in a generation earlier than these kids, and there was a famous, almost mythical skater in New York City. His name was Harry, and he was a Brazilian New Yorker, and he came and he was just kind of like mythic. Like we would hear about him on Long Island and we would go to the Brooklyn banks to see Harry skate. And the whole thing is, was he there? What does he look like? Is he a real person? And so, like, this whole idea of street skating in New York City has a kind of, a birthplace, I think, at the Brooklyn banks. And in this documentary, as well as in the film, these kids are skaters and they kind of come out of that culture of kind of, what is a kind of rough and tumble skate world in New York City? And these kids are badasses. But what you start to see in the skate world, and it's still true today, is the emergence of a kind of fashion brand, in this
Yeah.
case, Supreme.
Right.
Supreme
In Zoo York
becomes
too. Yeah.
Zoo York, right? This
Yep.
becomes like ground zero for these kids as they're making the film Kids. And it was super interesting to me to think about not only these kids and their kind of tough lives, but like these people who are coming in and creating a scene, almost like you have with punk and the Sex Pistols in London, around these kids. And they become, in some ways, the fodder for a whole new cultural moment, which this film kind of kicks off, but also in some ways, like all fodder, a bit of cannon fodder for the leftover of what happens, after that kind of moment. So I immediately started thinking about so much of Kids in this movie, as well as the documentary, is also embedded deeply in the changes, economic and cultural, that are happening in New York City at that moment.
Yeah, and we have the Larry Clark portrait of these kids, which is built around this very transgressive aesthetic, right? He is taken to task at Cannes when this film, where it premieres, and about this idea of kids are just obsessed with sex and drinking and drugs, and that's what the entire film's about. I mean, and it's really, really raw. It's this the identity of the two primary characters. Justin Pierce plays Casper, and Telly. Who plays
It's
Telly?
Leo Fitzpatrick, I think.
And Leo Fitzpatrick, who he basically becomes the character that he is. Like Telly becomes the character he is in The Wire. You can make this simple. Unsurprising, he makes his way to Baltimore and becomes a junkie.
And someone says he got AIDS twice in Reddit.
Yeah. It's true. And so from the beginning of the film, Larry Clark, the identity of the kids is their obsession with sex, and like Telly's obsession with deflowering virgins, and he's talking to Casper about this, and the film literally opens with him making out with a girl, and it's really, really uncomfortable. There's nothing romantic about it at all, and he's just seducing this young girl, and that's his point of view. And it quickly devolves into this discussion that's a set of girls that are at one girl's house talking about sex, and a set of boys talking about sex, and their points of view couldn't be more divergent. But both of them this is all they care about, and this is all they talk about. The boys are basically drinking 40s the entire time and smoking and doing whippets, while the girls are just hanging out, but just equally being kind of crass and talking about their sexual exploits.
It's truly,
and that's the Larry,
if you will.
Yeah, and it's the Larry Clark version. But I think what's fun is, like, I think we should immediately contrast it with the Hamilton Harris perspective. Like, how does he start the story of the kids?
Yeah, so Hamilton Harris in the documentary We Were Once Kids in 2001 kind of does a little bit of what I just did. He talks about New York City. He talks about the various kids who were in the documentary. And it's very interesting. He makes a choice. Like, he's not talking about Chloe Sevigny. He's not talking about Rosario Dawson or even Leo Fitzpatrick. Those are the ones of this film who kind of went on to have a bit of a career, some more significant than others. But he talks about all the rest of the kids who were kind of left behind. And those kids weren't just, oversexed individuals. They were kids with real family problems. They were kids who were super interesting, the diversity of these kids, and it makes sense in New York City. But also, the women who get not the same kind of voice in the film as they do in the documentary. I mean, there was one particular woman in the documentary who talks extensively about how pissed off she was about the script that Harmony Korine wrote and how it was completely sexist and it didn't represent women beyond them just being kind of, objects of rape and kind of, normalizing rape culture in some
and
ways.
misogyny. Yeah, that was Haile Ann Krasnow. Yeah, she
was great.
She and Priscilla Forsyth, they're and what's interesting is like, so I don't think Haile Ann Krasnow was really in the film.
She said no to it because
she said no. But Priscilla Forsyth is in that group of girls that are talking about sex, and she has one line that it's like, I just love sex. It's all I think about. Blah blah blah, and she can't believe like her friends when she went to the screening. She's like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. And she at one point, I think it's Priscilla talks about Harold Hunter and Justin Pierce being the kind of two. They weren't gatekeepers. They were more of like the people that would invite people in. There's this great story that Hamilton Harris talks about how Hunter was the one that made him feel, come on and join our group. Like, I can see you're someone who's struggling. You should be part of our group. Join our family. And Justin Pierce, similarly with his crazy energy, was also someone that like Haile Ann Krasnow saying like, we were all like always with Justin. Justin was this person that we were taking care of one another. And they tell these stories about like, okay, we don't have food now. Who's going to steal the bread? Who's going to steal the meat, cheese and stuff like that. And then they would make a picnic of the food that they stole from the grocery store because that was the only food they had. Right.
Yeah, and this is where it's interesting because you see this in the documentary, them talking about this family, and Justin was a runaway, and Harry's family, both his parents were in prison for drugs. You had real like tragic stories for many of these kids. Some of them had more guidance than others, but it seemed like none of them had real guidance in some ways. And, these kids are telling their stories. And as they're telling the stories in the documentary, you realize like Harmony Korine and Larry Clark just lifted these kids' stories and these kids' lives and just, basically pieced them together in a very episodic movie that's not a very complex plot. It takes place over 24 hours.
Yeah.
And, not to give too much away, as you said, Telly is all about de-virginizing young girls. And his friend, Casper, is all about like, oh my God, you're a hero, but then I'll fight with anyone and do any drugs and be as crazy as I can be. And then parallel to that, you finally get this character, Chloe Sevigny, whose name in the movie
Jenny.
is what? Jenny.
Yep.
And she starts to realize, and she goes with her friend to get tested for AIDS.
Ruby, who's Rosario Dawson. Yeah.
Who's awesome. And so gets tested for AIDS. And Rosario Dawson's character has been very, I want to say
promiscuous. Yeah.
Promiscuous. Yeah. Thank
you. It's fine.
Prolific, maybe. And she's telling about the various, intercourse she's had. And like everybody in the movie theater is probably like, what?
Yeah.
And, it's really kind of graphic. Whereas Chloe is you kind of relate to her as the movie goer. Jenny, I'm sorry. Jenny is kind of like, I've only had with one partner, right? And
Kelly.
I just came here. I come here to basically be your friend and accompany you. And it turns out in the twist of the movie that Jenny has contracted AIDS. And now she's on a hunt for Telly, who's the only person she had intercourse with, to kind of say, look, you have AIDS. And we now know that Telly has been having sex with at least one, but assuming, given how prolific he is, with many young girls over the course of the last months. And that's kind of the narrative push of this film. Would you
Right.
agree with that?
Yeah, and so that's like that is the MacGuffin, like, which is a disgusting MacGuffin, but that's
Yeah,
like
it
literally
is.
the narrative device of this film. And it's really interesting because, you know, at one point, I think it's back to the documentary. It's Hylian Krasnow is confronting Harmony Korine, because has integrated himself as like a skater kid. You know, unlike Larry Clark, he kind of predates Larry Clark. He was at NYU for a year. He ends up dropping out, is from what I can understand, but I could be wrong from the Wikipedia. So he has some affinity. He's not of the same type of background. He grew up in California, but he's been shifted around. His family it has some displaced aspects to it, but he was supported in many ways at the same time, especially interests in film from his father in particular was described in his Wikipedia. And so Harmony's part of this group. But at the same time, when, you know, at one point after the film enters the group's lives, in that it's going to be made, and there is this contrast of kids who are like, I don't know, who's the creepy old dude, the 49-year-old and Larry Clark, and what are they doing, trying to tell our story. But at the same time, like, you know, Hylian Krasnow is talking about, well, I'm not going to deny Hunter and Justin an opportunity to make some money, because this might be their chance. We don't know. We're literally kids. And so it's in that context that she's kind of interrogating, or she describes how she interrogated Harmony's, you know, rapey plot and its misogynistic plot. Why is that our story? There's so much more to us than that story.
Yeah, it's right. And there are other characters, and she was definitely a great kind of counterpoint to what you see in the narrative. And she kind of echoes a lot of what Bell Hooks critiqued this movie for, because Bell Hooks writes about this movie extensively and talks about how it had so much potential, yet it became, in the end, for all its kind of explosiveness as a controversial film, it was deeply conservative. And, you know, she kind of struggles with that. And I think there are a bunch of kids, as they're telling the story in We Were Once Kids. One of my favorites, and I don't remember his name, but he has a kind of big goatee, and he was a hardcore skater. And he was like, I hated when Larry Clark came in and all these people, because I just wanted to skate, and we all used to skate, and now everyone was wanting to be a wannabe movie star, and I just wanted to skate. And he was this hardcore. You had this kind of deep Manhattan or Brooklyn accent, and like he was just pissed. He didn't trust them. They were outsiders. No good could come from him or Harmony or any of them, even Larry in particular. And you got the sense that Larry had been hanging around them for quite a while.
Yeah,
taking
really
pictures, giving them drugs, essentially like ingratiating himself to this group of kids, trying to fit in. He was dressing like them, according to some of the folks in the documentary. And like he had an alternative plan. At the same time, he was struggling with his own addiction. He was a heroin addict. And so he was, and that's kind of what his Tulsa books, which dealt with that in the 70s, was all about people shooting up. And he got these kind of very, you know, very hardcore pictures of people shooting up, and it was very vivid. And even you would have women who were pregnant who were shooting up heroin, and he was taking these pictures, right? And there's that whole question of, at what point are you a friend, or are you intervening, and at what point are you an artist just exploiting what you're seeing? And I think that's an issue that carries on here in this movie. At what point is he, you know, facilitating the dysfunction? And at what point is he, you know, truly using them to make a piece of art that he will profit from?
Right. And there's this one of my favorite parallel examples in the film is like, so there's in Kids, you know, Washington Square Park features very centrally, as it did in real life. This is where you had the punks, and you had the skaters, and you had all these different cultures kind of colliding in a space where you could be slightly transgressive. You know, the cops would kind of steer clear of it. This was a time in New York where they weren't they were about to heavily police more and more, and just like clear any transgressive activities. And there's this scene where all the boys are hanging out, and it's the same scene where Hamilton literally rolls a blunt, and they all literally get high within this scene. And then Casper has a confrontation with a guy, and they're facing off with one another. And then suddenly Harold comes behind this guy that's confronting Casper and knocks him out with a skateboard. And the entire posse of kids pile on and start beating him relentlessly. And they beat the hell out of him. In the documentary, there's a similar scene. And there's this scene where all the kids are about to pile on and start beating on this guy. And someone in the middle says, "What the fuck are you guys all doing? He's a human being. He has thoughts too." And it's this literal contrast. Like, these kids are animals, right? From Larry
Which
Clark's
is what
point of
everyone
view.
says after the movie comes
they're
out.
animals. To the documentary shows, they're like, no, he's one of us. He might have fucked up in the moment, but he's one of us. Don't beat him down.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because, like, I remember watching this film in the 90s and just like, you're like, yeah, this is what the world's like. It's really fucked up. We were like this Gen X, stereotype of like, the world's fucked. Like, it needs a reset. You know what I mean? And I'm just so angry at myself now to have been, pegged this way and seen this so wrongly and not realize how we were being sold a bill of goods.
Yeah, it was, the documentary was truly eye-opening for me about, just what a vampire Larry Clark was on these kids. Like, that was, wow. I was like, wow. I thought like he was an artist who kind of brought in these actors. Some might have been real, but I had no idea he was like planning himself with these kids, taking their pictures, going on to selling them at various, galleries around New York City for thousands of dollars, kind of doing what he did in Oklahoma, but this time in New York. And it was interesting to me because when I saw this movie, I was in LA. And so I had grown up around this area because, when I was in Long Island, we would take the Long Island Railroad in to Penn Station, and we come down to Bleecker Street, and then we would walk over through Washington Square Park to CBGB's. And that was something we did pretty regular for these kind of CBGB matinees. And I remember one Sunday when we went in, the Cro-Mags and Agnostic Front were playing. And these were like hardcore New York punk bands, right? Like, they were like fucking, I'll eat you. And so I went, and I was like a 15-year-old, and I was like, kind of scared. My older brother was we were not fitting in with this crowd. Let's just be clear. Anyway, a fight breaks out. It's like, a serious fight, kind of like you see in Kids. And at the end of the fight, you realize one of the guys had bit off another guy's finger.
Oh my God.
And I was like, what? And so, like, when I saw this, the violence of it and that sense of like, the aggressiveness, that aggro-ness of this kind of community in the Lower East Side didn't strike me as false. I will say that. He may have been exploiting it, but there was a level of aggressiveness and like fuck the world, nothing matters. I will basically bite your finger off or worse.
Mm-hmm.
And so this film captured a bit of this. Like, this film did capture some really primal elements, but it was basically because of those kid actors, right? And like, Harmony Korine and Larry Clark were basically just riding that energy, to your point earlier.
Yeah. And they talk a lot about like, I think between, who are the two? I want to just keep making sure I get their names right. Between Hailey Ann Krasnow and Priscilla Forsyth, they talked a lot about like Harold and Justin's unique energy and just how much they meant to this group of people. Like, Harold was just his energy was infectious, and he was just all over the place all the time and incredibly charismatic. And Justin was crazy. Like, he was this person who would do anything, and he's drinking a hell of a lot and he's smoking a hell of a lot. And in the film, you see the spaces that they're living in and existing in, and you're just like, whoa, this is really, really rough. And so you get a sense that they're really trying to take care of one another, but they are living lives that are very hardcore. And Larry Clark does capture that. It is seemingly living on that line of documentary and fiction, because there are so many people that are true friends of Harold and Justin that they invited in. And it's like, hey, we're all going to get to be in a movie together. Isn't this going to be so freaking cool? And yeah, at the beginning, it feels like, wow, this is so awesome. Like, look at all these cameras. Look at the way that they're all paying attention to us. And there's this incredible story, these stories that Hylianne or Priscilla, I can't remember which one, is talking about how Justin, towards the end of the filming, who in particular was thriving with the attention, because he turns out to be quite a talent. Like, he ends up winning the Independent Spirit Award as the breakout actor of 1996. It's an independent. We've already talked about the Independent Spirit Awards for our previous podcast, and how it's important to this moment of indie film. And he's a breakout star, and he goes up on stage and he drags Harold up there with him. Right. And there's this funny moment where people are kind of first Justin talks awkwardly, but then Harold talks, and they're both like thanking their moms, of course, because their dads are not in their lives. But then Harold does this thing where he thanks his family, and he starts to cry, but the audience is laughing because they don't understand what he's doing. Is he role playing? Is it real? But you're led to believe, if you've watched the film, the documentary, and understand, he's talking about the kids on the street. He's talking about his family that took care of him, and he continued to take care of him, because Hamilton Harris himself talks about how much of an influence Harold was about his life, and saying, like, don't, take serious doing drugs. Like, because Hamilton was like a total pothead. Like, he smoked crazy amounts, and he credits Harold for like setting him straight a bit.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things in the documentary, which I highly recommend. In fact,
if you can find it, it's really hard to find.
It is amazing. And so one of the things Hamilton says, as well as some other people who talk about Harold, is everyone loved Harold. And Harold was the kind of like communal glue that brought that Washington Square crew together. And I got the feeling that Harold was basically the one who Larry and Harmony Korine went to the broker, right? Like, say I'm okay, say this person's okay, do this. Like, he was the one who they were kind of using to make sure that everyone, because you could see that Washington Square crew turning on you very quickly, because they were no nonsense kids, right? They were not fucking around. And Harold was the one who they were using to make it happen. And you see Harold in those, just how much energy he had, his ways danced and all the stuff. It's amazing. But you also see him in the documentary. I mean, I say documentary, you see him in the actual film, kids. And he's who he is in the documentary, right? Like,
he's magnetic, though, like
all of energy. Yeah.
And but even his facial features, he's just this magnetic superstar of a sort. And you're just like, in today's era, he'd be like a reality television star. Well, he'd be just whatever. He'd be like a TikTok star. I don't fucking care what he could have been. And it's interesting because you talked about how they were gatekeepers, because there's a story. One of the other people in the documentary is John Abrahams, who is one of the kids from Washington Square Park, who turns out to be he plays Steven, who is the person who owns the apartment at the end of the film, right?
Yeah.
And so John Abrams was a skater, but kind of an outsider, and he talks about, like, during the Washington Square Park scene, he was getting shit from everybody else, and it was it was either Harold or Justin or both of them that said, no, he's cool. And as soon as they said, you're cool, you were cool, and you were okay to be in this group. And so that's how much of how important they were to that community.
And that's when, as you're watching the documentary, and it's so trippy because, Kids, the 1995 movie, is kind of a documentary. It has all the trappings of a documentary in terms of the filmmakers exploiting the communities that they move in with, and all of these elements that you learn about with documentary film. But when you see the actual documentary, where the community, these kids now are in their 40s, assumingly, or late 40s, early 50s, and they're talking and reflecting back on this. And, one of the things you really start to realize as they're is that Justin and Harold are not going to show up in this documentary. We're not going to see those two. And there's a reason. And so even the documentary starts to take on this invisible, palpable, like tension around like what the fuck happened to Justin and Harold, and like, oh my God, I think I know this. And this is something that on the Family Pictures podcast, which you're listening to, and is one of the best podcasts you probably have ever listened to. We talk about the exploitation of kids again and again in this Family Picture podcast. And like
Paper Moon was one of the starters of that, right?
Exactly. And this is a really, I mean, I came away from the documentary about the original film thinking about, Jesus Christ, like this was a complete exploitation fest. Because if you know anything about Kids, the movie in 1995, because of the controversy that surrounded it and all of the kind of pundits coming out and saying, this is our youth today, they're nihilistic, they have no future, they're animals, right? That controversy meant that it was super popular and also super successful. Not only in the US, in particular, it's successful in Europe. And so this film grossed on $1 million or $1.5 million budget, $20+ million.
Yeah, which each Weinstein brother pocketed $2 million at the time.
And that's another piece here, because we talk about exploitation and that long leg of exploitation. Who's involved in the distribution of this after Disney bought it and then was like, wait, we can't distribute this film. This is not in the Disney portfolio. So they sold it back to the Weinstein brothers, who were kind of the golden boys of the independent era of the 90s, which is such a weird, unraveling that needs to be done, I think, over the course of these podcasts. And these two, they banked, like you said, $2 million each. Whereas we hear in the documentary about how much the kids made who were in the film. And that was a very interesting story. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, they talk about how, so the movie happens and it's exhilarating, a Hollywood film production, even like you glimpse it as someone who's a resident of New York all the time, and you walk through a street at night and there's lights everywhere and there's people with walkie-talkies, and there's so much attention being placed on creating these pictures, these little moments, and you feel larger than life, I imagine, as a result of that. And so then they left and they're gone. And it's what happens is like, so Larry and Harmony Korine disappear, but then they reappear about 3 or 4 months later and invite everybody for the premiere downtown in Tribeca. And they talk about the premiere and they're all together. And it's really joyous and raucous because it's them getting to share the movie with one another. And so it's really exciting. Every time they see someone that they recognize, the whole theater's erupting. They don't give a shit about the plot. They don't give a shit about the narrative. It's just like, that's you, that's you, that's you. And they're yelling and screaming. And then it leads to this amazing party. And they talk about how the food was incredible, some of the best food they've ever eaten at this thing. And then like Larry Clark's kind of walking around passing out cash, like hundreds of dollars to each person. And they're signing these little contracts. They're signing away their rights.
That's so scummy. Like after it's all done, after he knows it's going to be a gigantic film, he goes and says, well, actually, here's a contract for you non-SAG actors, and here's hush money, essentially. Right. And he gives $1,000 to probably 15 or 20 kids. Do the math, right? Like it's nothing. And I think there's a certain amount of resentment in the 2021 documentary about, just how he played that. Like he calculated the fact that this was going to be a success and he had to cover his ass legally and financially. And so he, despite everything he took from these kids over the previous X amount of months or years, he was going to basically screw them royally, and did. And that was the point in the documentary where I was like, yeah, I can't look at that movie Kids in the same way, to your point, after watching this documentary, right? In fact, the documentary was the better film.
Yeah. And it's funny because like I knew gonna do it for a rewatch. I don't think I've ever rewatched Kids before. So I saw it in the theater in 1995. I used to go to the Art House Theater in Cambridge. And I used to I was working as a mover at the time while I was in art school. And if you were done early, like if some a game, if a job ended early, I'd just like, oh, I'm just going to go to the art theater, and I didn't even care what was playing. I just watch whatever was there. And this is how I saw, kids. This is how I saw, I think, the Kevin Smith movie Clerks and a bunch of other things at the time, just because this is the '90s. And so it was exhilarating because it was this moment and you're just kind of like, what just happened? These films meant so much in these moments. You're like, this is a new voice. This is really exciting. This is really important. And that's what it felt like. But at the same time, now watching it in retrospect, and one I think the important scenes in the documentary is how the film makes it to Cannes. And I don't think it wins the Palme d'Or, but it's lauded in there. And critics laud this film too. Like Siskel and Ebert are both like thumbs up.
Siskel was, I mean, Ebert was a huge champion of this film.
Yeah. And so what happens is but then you see the interrogation of the journalists and Larry Clark's response to it. And, this being the sunglass wearing, like, I'm not going to confront you. He's wearing his sunglasses and they're asking questions. So like, how old are they? Like, so, the backdrop of this film is the 4 boys, right? And there's no way they're older than 14, all 4 of these boys.
Oh yeah. If they're a day over 14, I'd be surprised.
Right. And the one second from the left is Javier, and Javier appears in the documentary, and he tells a story about how they had 10 pre-rolled blunts that they were smoking. These 4 kids on set. And literally one of the journalists asks at Cannes, it's like, so were they doing drugs? Were they really doing drugs? And Harmony Korine is like, oh no, there were no drugs. And you're just like,
Larry Clark says that too. He's like, no, there were no drugs.
No drugs.
And he was avoiding all the questions. He was like, which kid? Because they were like, how old were these kids? He was like, which kid?
Right.
And then he was also like, this is a movie. He says, as if like, what are we talking about these kids? That's not the point. Mm-hmm. It's like a fictional movie. But I think the point is it's not. Even if it tries to be, that's just a thin guise for a documentary that really, you talk about what's the role of the documentary, filmmaker in the narrative they're telling. Well, like, Larry Clark is certainly defining the parameters of what these kids can and can't do on his set to make it. And these 4 kids that are in the backdrop, they're freaking zonked. Yeah. They're like as high as can be by the end of this take. They've smoked 10 joints. And at the final scene where Casper is essentially raping Jenny, right? One of these 4 kids is in the background sleeping.
Yeah, Javier, the one with his arms behind his head.
And he's really sleeping.
He tells like he's totally passed out. He's like, I am not awake. And you can see me in the background, and like even the smallest things like that, the lack of agency you have, even as like a kid actor, your parents obviously aren't around, that are looking out for. There's no parents of these kid actors. Like we've talked about this many times about child actors and all of the safety standards that exist now. And even just like, there's no parents to be seen anywhere. And Larry Clark's been hosting parties in his apartment. And, there's Hamilton talks about how like, well, we would hang out with him because he had good weed, and so to think about how here's a film set in an apartment with dozens of kids in it. And these 4 in particular are being like smushed together for this shot. And this went on for an hour. Javier talks about how they basically told us to just talk to one another for an hour.
And it was interesting, the moral outrage in Cannes amongst the European reporters. And there was some moral outrage in the US, but that was more about the film. It never seemed, at least as I could see, to cover the actual making of, the production of.
Right.
Whereas the Europeans were like, how the hell did you make this film? How could you make it without actually doing it? And he was really at a certain point, because the Cannes clip is great. At a certain point, he's like, I'm new to this, but I didn't think that these question and answers would be so aggressive. Yeah. And like, he was like really thrown off by the fact that they were like, what is wrong with you? And
Yeah.
that's a wake up call, post facto to think about, like, yeah, Larry Clark in this kind of equation of making the film and what he was, and I think he was handing off a lot of these more questionable deeds probably to the kids who he'd been cultivating, like Harold or like Casper or whoever. Like, they were the ones who were probably giving these kids joints. They were the ones who were probably doing X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
and truly using them to kind of cover his ass, I imagine, but also to make this film. And yeah, it's hard for me to kind of, it was hard to watch the film because I watched the documentary first and then Kids again, because I had watched Kids
Oh,
recently.
really? Oh,
Yeah, so I
I
did it in
intentionally didn't
reverse.
watch I did it the reverse. I did the kids rewatch, then the documentary. And if I had watched the documentary first, I don't know if I would have made it through the whole film. Like
Yeah,
I was fast forwarding the very final scene with the rape scene with Casper and Jenny characters, because I know what's going to happen, and it's just so, like, you're just like, I don't need. And then,
yeah,
but just to know about Javier actually being fucking zonked out, and in
yeah,
and I'm so glad I watched it, because like I said, you get so emotionally freaked out because of the documentary. And part of this is like, and notice how for the most of this, we've basically ignored the plot, because there is no plot, to this
no,
film. Like, Jenny is traveling through the city, and she hits a club, and she ends up getting like a roofied by a friend, weirdly, as someone who appears to be
yeah.
a friend.
Well, who's
And
Harmony Korine?
yeah. Oh, right. I forgot about that. Yeah, it is
Yeah,
Harmony Korine playing this friend in the Coke bottle glasses.
yeah,
And so she's like more and more disoriented towards the end of the film, and she finally makes her way to the party at Stevens, and he's the one kind of other kind of actor. And Rosario Dawson is not in the film at all post, like, learning she doesn't have AIDS. And there are these brief glimmers, just to like flesh them out. There's a few glimmers of family. Like, we do go to Telly's
yeah,
parents'
which is
house,
great.
and Telly with Casper, she's got a new baby, and Casper's like leering at his mom breastfeeding, and it's crazy shit. And then they're like, Telly's
It's
being really
great.
respectful to his mom and nice to her. It's like, oh, can I just have some money? Meanwhile, he's going into her room and stealing cash out of the secret stash inside one of the shoes that's in the shoe rack that's hanging on the closet. So the production design and the realism is so, you just can't help but be incredibly invested in this situation. And I guess it's like important to keep reminding the audience how immersive the film Kids was,
Yeah,
and how we get so invested in, Jenny's effort to, in some sense, try to stop Telly, and tell him what's going on. And Telly's like seduction, and Harold, and Casper's, like, you know, energy, and going swimming by hopping over the fence, and the Lower East Side, and just Lower East Side being a character, someone who lived in the East Village very briefly, like, in recognizing, oh, there's the cube by Astor Place, and oh, there's, like,
yeah,
the walkway around this or
absolutely.
the Lower East Side, like, in knowing Alphabet City, and in the projects that are in Alphabet City, where Harold's character comes from, and actually in real life is kind of in and out of with his brother. We don't even know of his brother except for from the documentary.
I think another piece that you bring up, and you brought it up earlier, and it was kind of a big piece too
Oh, you
for,
have picture disappear.
yeah, what's that? Let's see if I can fix it.
That's okay.
But anyway, the one of the things that was, for me super interesting is, I must have done it by mistake. But one of the things that was super interesting for me was the whole idea of being in, huh,
Yeah, you
hold
switch
on.
cameras. It's okay though.
Yeah, but my other one is not working. Okay, well, I'm gonna
Just
have to
use this one.
change cameras.
Yeah, that's
But
fine.
um, the other thing that was interesting to me is, the backdrop of the AIDS pandemic. Now, I think
Yep.
Clark and them, they kind of, it was somewhat, again, conservative, and like it was another kind of slick plot point. But if you lived in this moment, it was real. Like, I was in 1992, kind of had one of my first long term girlfriends. We lived together. And in fact, before, we got super serious, she was like, we got to take an AIDS test.
Yeah.
And we got to go. And we went to a clinic, much like the one in the Lower East Side, but we were in Long Beach, California. And we did that. And so doing that in 92 and then seeing this movie, it was like, yeah, like that was a moment. Like it's hard for people living now, I imagine, for kids coming up to understand like how horrific it was, the idea of contracting this disease, right? Because it was at that point a death sentence for most situations, and it was kind of always in the back of your mind, like, oh no, I could actually be in a situation, of casual sex and contract AIDS, and essentially, I mean, that's what you look at when you see Jenny in this film. You say like she's not going to survive.
No, and
Like,
she's talking to her she tries to call home to get her mom on the phone right after the test, and the Ruby character, Rosario Dawson's with her, and she's like, she gets her brother on the phone instead, and she's like, I don't want to tell my brother I'm going to die. And Rosario, the Ruby character, is like, oh, it's going to be okay, and it's going to be okay. But at this moment, as you're describing, it's not going to be okay. And
no.
ironically, I did the same thing too with a college girlfriend. Like we both got tested, and it's just like so crazy. I mean, you can kind of put it in the context of like COVID and vaccines and how this medical emergency had such a big impact on society. And I think about like my kids and the notion of like when we all went as a family to get vaccinated, and when the kids were later on, they weren't allowed to get vaccinated because the vaccine hadn't been approved yet for kids yet. And their lives had already been displaced. Their schooling here in the city in particular, as well as many other places across the country and the world. But it had that kind of cultural, if to give people context, that's the same kind of cultural thrust HIV and testing had on everyday people that were trying to think about sex and just what it meant to make that choice.
And it came though with the homophobia. So that was the other piece to it, right? Like it came with a deep cultural homophobia, that was kind of abused by the far right and this whole Christian idea. And like, so like it had this. And so certain communities were devastated by it. And like some of them didn't get, obviously, and there's still narratives and movies and whole ways of trying to understand that moment for a whole contingent of the population that just didn't get the attention and that didn't get the maybe the research that COVID got, because it was everyone, right? But this was dedicated to intravenous drug users and often gay men. And so maybe they didn't put the same research in, because we learned 20, 30 years later that there were drugs that could manage it. So like, it's an interesting post facto to look back in the 90s and say, if you had that, it was the kiss of death. And so it was a serious thing. Like, and I think Larry Clark and Harmony Korine, play on that, but they also exploit it. And so that's one of the things that in the movie, even when I saw it in 95, I was a little bit like, that's exploitative. But to you, another point you made that I really liked is 90s independent film. So that same girlfriend who I had talked about, in 92, we had done this. Well, she was going to university at UCLA to study film. And so we moved up to LA, and LA was like film heaven. There were films like, The Bruin, Westwood, The National, all these amazing film houses. And so like all of these films were playing there. And so I basically saw Reservoir Dogs, Kids,
Living in Oblivion was the co-feature at the Angelica in the documentary. I was like, oh, that's it. Number one. It's like the New York Art House Theater in the Village was the Angelica, and that all the lines that are pictured are the Angelica, and Kids is featured with Living in Oblivion, which was like a Steve Buscemi, one of his first films. And it was an amazing film.
Yeah. Duck Soup was another one I saw with Steve Buscemi. So like that also moment, this film brings me back to it. Like it brings me back to that moment of the 90s of going to films. I saw more films in that 3 years than I've probably seen a lot of films in the last 20, 30 years. But I saw a lot of films in those 3 years.
Well, you're catching up because of this podcast, Jim Groom.
Exactly. But she was a film student, so that's all she wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so I was like, yeah, like
Yeah.
this is great. Popcorn, soda, and like whatever's
Uh-huh.
on the screen. But it was an interesting time. This film transports me back to
Yeah.
that 90s era for me in LA, seeing a ton of films and kind of coming up with the 90s independent spirit of that moment, right? I saw Pulp Fiction at that Angelica in New York City.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And so to coincide, so as we're describing, this was a moment. And so kids becomes a thing. The American portrait of it versus the European perspective is kind of interesting. Like the American portrait is still kind of stuck in this Reagan Bush-esque cartoonist, like, these are all the things that we were afraid of are coming true. And gosh, we have to do something about it. The kids are all fucked up. It's all wrong. And so at the same time, um, because it's a moment, you have Justin, and even though what's also noted in the documentary is at Cannes and at the festival, none of the kids are actually invited to the film. It's just Harmony and Larry Clark that are there. But of course, the kids, they're still in the streets of New York, literally around the corner skating from the Angelica, which is only like 4 blocks from Washington Square Park. And so people that have just watched Kids will walk outside and they would see Harold. They would see Justin. They're like, oh my God, you're the kids from Kids. And this becomes the thing. It's like they become the kids from Kids. And this becomes this important pivot point in the documentary that tells the story of Justin and Harold, and what happened. And so Justin and Harold, as I described, were at the Independent Spirit Awards together, and Justin actually wins the breakout star from an independent film, and he goes to LA first. And he starts to get in the movies, and he's actually doing well. Like he's a natural. He's more than even like Chloe Sevigny and Rosario Dawson initially. He's getting a lot of roles. He gets in the Friday sequel that doesn't do well critically, but is adored with Ice Cube. And he plays a character named Roach, and does super well. And he gets a girlfriend, and he's still in touch with, in particular, both Hamilton and I just kind of want to make sure I never get their names out. And Hailey Krasner, Priscilla from back home in New York. And Hamilton talks about a lot about how it's very clear that Justin is still struggling. Like, even though he's having a moment, and they all wanted them to go, they were afraid for them to go to LA, and they were afraid for them to not have their support system anymore, to not have their family around them anymore. But they couldn't say like, no, this was their chance. This is what they were dreaming of. Like, you're getting out of, this is your chance to get up there. And he's met this woman, Gina, and they get married in Las Vegas, and she's pregnant. And you get this sense like, holy fuck, like Justin's going to make it. And then his wife loses the baby. And at the same time, we hear through Hamilton that things are going wrong. And then moments later, we learn he's killed himself. He's hanged himself in a hotel room in Vegas.
Yeah. And that is terrible.
And it's devastating. Like, it's so fucking devastating. And it makes you, and it made me just, like I said, I've said already, like, I'm just so angry. My thinking about this film previously, and I'm so glad we're doing this. Like, when we made this list of indie films and Jim's like, yeah, let's do Kids. I was like, oh fuck, this is of course, Jim picks the rough one first. Like, let's
start with it. Right.
Yeah. Let's start with the really more hardcore one. But now I'm so glad, because I'm so glad this is making me face the perspectives I had versus the perspectives that can be rediscovered, and in a sense, like, reclaiming. That's why this, like, The Chosen Family and Their Stolen Story is the title, is because their story was stolen. Like they said, like, I love how Hailey Ann is like, why are we telling this story of rape and misogyny? There was so much more to us.
Yeah. And, and you realize as these kids are, because, on the news, when they report Justin Pierce's death, it's like, the kid from the Kids hung himself, and it was at Las Vegas. It was just a moment on news, and it was done. But then you hear his family, if you will, from Washington Square Park, recounting it and crying, and like you can see the devastation that this film has left behind them. And that's just the first of it. And like, so you get the Justin Pierce story, and that's devastating. And all of them are basically saying, if Larry Clark never came into our life, if this film had never happened, we might still have him. There's no guarantee of that. He was
Yeah.
obviously a loose cannon, but like, you get the sense that, you open up a kid to the world of Hollywood and they're unstable. It's time and time again, you see how that just kind of like,
no support system.
it exacerbates that trouble that you already have. So we learned that from the documentary. And so the first shoe drops. And then we return and they start talking about, well, like Justin, Harold is trying to make it in Hollywood too. And so he, as we said earlier, he's this energetic figure. He's the one who actually made all the connections, I think, for Clark and Harmony Korine to kind of make this film and kind of make sure that this community accepted them and said, okay, because otherwise they would have been locked out of it, I'm sure. And so here he's thinking like, I'm going to get mine, right? Like, I'm going to get some reward for being that person, for being that connector. And you see that, like, as soon as that door opened, it's shut. And they had, after that premiere, maybe a couple of months of like, oh, this is exciting, or let's see what happened. And Justin Pierce obviously moved out to LA. But a lot of the other ones, it was just like back to being kids. And Hamilton said something I thought was really powerful. He's like, all right, I got to come to terms with the fact that that was that, and it's over, and it's not going to be anything greater.
Yep.
So I can go on with my life. And he kind of made a hard decision to say, I'm going to get married. I have kids of my own now. I'm not going to fall into this trap. Mm-hmm. And, he was a kind of, in the documentary, he's really kind of a ballast to kind of understand this community and who these kids were. And, you start, and he loved Harold. Harold is the one Harold was straight because his parents had kind of run into real problems with drugs. And I think at least they had serious issues, whether they had died or been in jail.
They both had died. Both of Harold's parents had died of drugs. His grandmother was raising him and renting her her rooms to let people shoot up. That was like his home life. It's like fucking insane.
It's insane. So
Harold is the one who's like, Hamilton talked about, like, back to that intervention. It's like, what happens if you smoke, it leads to heroin, and heroin leads to like your end. It's the end game. And like, once that starts to happen, because he's like, I've seen it. He's seen it in both his parents and the way that his grandmother used it as an opportunity just to survive. And, so Harold sadly is falling apart. And he's in LA. He's trying to play this character. It's like he almost, like, in another world, he could have been like part of the Jerky Boys and had a great time and been successful, but he has no community there to help him navigate that. And, John Abrahams, the person who played Steven, talked about he initially tried to help him with some readings of scripts, but he had so little education at that point in his life. He wasn't able to just gravitate towards it and hold on to it, even though he's literally getting to hang out with Leonardo DiCaprio. Right. And there's all this stuff.
Right. And he's like, DiCaprio was like, that was one of my favorite films. And like, these guys were riding on cloud nine for a while, but it was a hard fall. And so the documentary shows that hard fall with Harold. And you see Harold in the documentary and, well, actually in the film, like, he is like an Adonis, right?
Yeah.
He's got like a 20-pack on his stomach. He's super thin. He's like an amazingly fit and like, almost like David-esque like figure, if you will, in terms of body type. And, you see him later on, a few years later, and he's heavy set and he's in Washington Square Park, kind of trying to relive that, but also telling, someone who has a camera on him, how he's been wronged by these people and how he never got his. And you can see that he's kind of spiraling, that his moment had come and gone. And here he was. And one of the folks in the documentary said, still in the projects. And he said the one thing he didn't want to do is die in the projects.
It's his brother.
Was it the brother or was it the other skater kid?
No, well,
it's the short dark hair.
Oh yeah, well, there's that, but his brother, he's basically back home with his brother. He's back at Campos
Plaza. Who has the Harold sweatshirt,
right? And he's in Alphabet City again, right? And and he and his brother are trying to hold together. You know, his brother's trying to buoy him and he sees he's spiraling. And also we know that like Hamilton knows he's spiraling and his other friends know he's spiraling. And, you know, Harold's brother has a kid at this point, and there's this moment where they talk about they have a big fight, and Harold's still trying to be like just diffuse it by playing with his son, and he's like, "What the fuck are you doing?" And then moments later, he's like, he goes out and he comes back at 10 at night, and he knows he's fucked up, and then the next morning he goes to wake him up, and he's gone.
Yeah, cocaine overdose or some sort of related
heart attack. Right? Yeah. And Harold's importance to this family is illustrated by, her name is so interesting. Hailey Ann is so angry about this. It's like, here we go again. We're all going to get together and we're all going to cry. And it's going to be this moment. And she's just so frustrated by this. But at the same time, it is a really big moment. Like, the coming out for Harold in New York is massive. It's like he was clearly this center point still for so many hopes, and they wanted for him to succeed because they felt he deserved it. He was just this inviting luminous person that now is yet another one gone. Like, and that's that kind of tragic story.
And there was that sense there of like that, what would become a very fragile community in New York City, not only because of people like Larry Clark and what happened there, but because of the changing nature of the city and the influx of money and the fact that a lot of these places in Lower East Side were no longer rent controlled, and they were pushing people out because they had a new renaissance, like we said, that would come with, the police state that returns and Giuliani and all that complexity that comes later. But you can see just the fragility of those New York City communities. And Harold and this film in some ways stand in, not during the film, but almost post facto, as a metaphor for the changing nature of the city and what it did to these communities and how they were in some ways pushed out or robbed of opportunities, just like, Justin or Harold, for example, in this kind of documentary. But there was a real nice parallel that I think that filmmaker made in that documentary about a broader kind of shift that was happening in the culture. And something could be a cultural kind of touchstone like kids, but it can still be a horrible experience for all of those who were part of it, right? Like, it can be one thing and signify something as a cultural shift, but also be a terrible thing for those who were involved with it. And that's what this documentary lays bare. Yeah. And it's hard to kind of, balance those two things, given, like you said, I was 20 something when I saw this film and I was excited by it in some ways. One of the things I struggle with in this, not in this film, but watching the film again, and this, I don't know how much bearing it has on what we're talking about, but I'm interested in it. But it's the music. So music, the Folk Implosion, so Lou Barlow and the Folk Implosion, they do the soundtrack for it, like Jenny's theme and Daddy Never Understood, when that film it opens with, which is that song it opens with when Tally's having sex with the Virgin. And it's just a great opening. But then when you're in Washington Square Park, you have like Tribe Called Quest, right? And Oh God. And like, you have this kind of shift that is also another shift going on between the skateboarding world that was very punk and often sometimes very white in the 80s, shifting in the 90s to far more dominated by hip hop and far more diverse than it was in the previous generation. And I found that interesting because this film kind of, you brought in the kind of white punk band to kind of define the film, but it couldn't resist the fact that, the sport and the world was changing musically. And I think of this, like, my son's a skater. He skated a lot during COVID because the skate park here in Italy was kind of like, a oasis for these kids. And, all they listen to is hip hop. Like, punk is not even on the menu. And the whole skating world had kind of changed. And for many of them, Supreme is ground zero for the new skating culture. So in fact, this film and this moment in New York, of all places, not even Los Angeles, which is what you associate with skating. That would be more for the early Dogtown. This is ground zero for a whole skate culture that is still dominated by Supreme and this idea of hip hop and the city and the grit. And I'm watching it this time. I was really fascinated by that element of the film, about how it kind of, even though Supreme wasn't, really featured in the film, in the documentary, you realize that Supreme was where all these kids worked. It was what they were kind of, this brand was, again, like Larry Clark, riding on the backs of these kids to become a $2 billion brand. Like, talk about, Larry Clark made his couple of million. Supreme made their billions. Right?
Yeah.
So
it's true.
To me, I mean, the exploitation is all around. And I think New York City in the 90s is all about that. That exploitation, not only of these kids, but of the families and of the economics and of the shift in, the market. It's an interesting kind of touchstone for this film. This film is about far more than families and kids. It's about a shifting moment in our culture.
Yeah. I mean, it's this, it's this shift from the Gen X ironic detachment, the cynicism that we are in now. It's like, no, we're gonna financialize all that, and we're gonna use it in what you're speaking about. Is like Larry Clark. It's like, knew this was cool, and he knew, and it made me angry. And as I've said many times now in retrospect, how cool I thought it was.
Yeah.
And we were the product. We were who they were selling this product to. And the kids, and to end, I'd rather end on the documentary ultimately, if that's okay, because
it is.
What's so great about Hamilton is he speaks about how they're still reconciling their lives, and he talks about how he moved to the Netherlands with his wife and his two boys, and is holding on to having a family. And many of the other characters, like we see Hailey Ann and Priscilla and Harold's brother, and then the other black skater, I can't remember his name, that was presented, with their families and in being involved. And that's the thing. It's like, that's the message. It's like, and I think what's so ironic is like, out of the neglected generation, we speak more casually about this. Meanwhile, we never endured the kind of quote unquote neglect that these kids, but we were left to be free and do things on our own quite a bit. Ignored in a good way, we see. But ironically, it's our generation that turned into, and I've said this before, that we became the helicopter parents. We're so involved in our kids' lives, and so they speak, and that's how he tries to end this. Like Hamilton is like saying, this is how we make this choice. It's like, I get to choose my new family and be part of it. And and they still talk about, and there's something that I don't think we should even mention, the way the documentary ends.
Oh,
I want people to go watch it. We should
leave it.
We're going to leave it. Yeah, we got to leave it.
Good call. Because I was going to go in there, but you're right. We need to have people experience that.
Yeah, there's something.
It's good.
It's just so freaking good. It's hard to find. I encourage you to look for it through Reddit searches, and there's, because it's not on Amazon in the United States. And so I had to find like some site that was hosting it that you're not going to find unless you get into a Reddit thread. And that's how I ultimately was able to get access to it.
Pro tip, hint. Guess what?
Yeah.
There are other means to secure
please
this
get
video.
there, because this is the Reclaim Kids podcast. I am so glad we did this movie, even though I was kind of terrified of doing it, to be honest, when I first put it on this list of indie family films that we're kind of endeavoring to wend our way through. I don't know what's next, but
I'll tell you though, a quick story before you close.
Go.
You're about to close, and you're a genius, so I don't mean to interrupt you, but like, so I had this arcade with Tim, and we did this video store, and so I bought a whole bunch of VHS tapes, and Kids was one of them, because I bought tapes from the 80s and 90s, and I have it, and I still have the VHS tape of Kids here. So anyway, we're starting, and it's opening night, and I'm like, yeah, let's play a video, and I just see Kids because it's got that kind of very colorful cover, and I'm like, yeah, let's do Kids, and I put it in. And like, we're opening up, it's the first day, families are coming in, and then Tim was like, what the fuck do you have on the TV right now? Turn it off, change it. And I was like, I forgot how insane this movie is. So yeah, that's a good.
What a way to open a store.
Yeah, I was like, kids, it would be great. You know what I mean? And it was not great.
No,
Not great.
no, it's not a great picture in a lot of ways, but it's an important picture, especially in the context of this, documentary that is really primarily the work of Eddie Martin and Hamilton Harris, and kind of fuck Larry.
Yeah, it is, and they called him at the end, which is great. Anyway,
yeah,
it's great. See it. It's awesome.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Bye bye.